Okay, so today we're going deep, really deep, into some pretty intense theological debate
Yeah, we're diving into the defensive lecture on the Sunnah of Muhammad.
by Mohammed Aman Al-Jami.
Exactly.
And huge thanks to Omar Ahmed Tohamy for that excellent translation you sent us.
Absolutely.
Now, this lecture is a direct response to some, well, let's just say controversial ideas put forward by someone called Lecturer Mahmoud.
Right, and all this was happening in Atbar.
So picture this. A specific time, a specific place, and this lecturer Mahmoud is stirring things up, questioning some pretty fundamental Islamic teachings.
And Al-Jami felt compelled to address these challenges head-on, to defend what he saw as the core of Islamic belief and practice.
And that's where we come in, right?
Yeah, our mission today is to really unpack these challenges and to understand Al-Jami's arguments in defense of the Sunnah.
Which is, and correct me if I'm wrong, the practices and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad.
Peace be upon him.
Peace be upon him, exactly.
And by delving into this, we're not just looking at a historical debate, we're also gaining insights into some ongoing discussions within Islam.
About authority, interpretation, the very essence of belief.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
Now, the first point of contention revolves around the idea of spiritual elevation.
Right, and this is where things get really interesting.
Tell me more.
Mahmoud claimed that through certain spiritual practices, you could reach such a high level that you could even be called Allah.
Whoa, hold on.
Yeah, and he went on to suggest that reaching this state would actually free you from all religious obligations.
So you become so spiritually advanced you don't even need to pray anymore.
That was the implication.
That's a pretty radical concept.
It is, and Al-Jami strongly condemned it, calling it a great slander.
He didn't hold back.
Not at all.
So how did he refute this idea?
Al-Jami argued that regardless of your spiritual station, even if someone were to be called Allah, which he saw as blasphemous in itself, it doesn't negate your religious duties.
It's about recognizing that even at the highest level of spiritual attainment, you're still a servant of God.
Exactly.
And calling someone Allah implies they should be worshipped.
Which is a direct violation of the Islamic principle of Tawhid, the oneness of God.
This idea of a human becoming divine, it's not just about skipping prayers. It strikes at the very core of Islamic monotheism.
Absolutely.
Now, building on this, Mahmoud also had some controversial views on prayer itself.
Yeah, he claimed that an elite group, whom he called the Gnostics, were exempt from prayer.
Exempt from prayer. That's a pretty huge claim.
It is, and Al-Jami immediately pointed out that Mahmoud seemed to be using the term Gnostics to refer to those who were actually ignorant.
Interesting.
And he went on to argue that this whole idea of exemption from prayer has no basis in the Prophet's teachings.
What did the Prophet do?
The Prophet himself consistently prayed, in all circumstances.
Right, leading by example.
Exactly. There's no record of him ever suggesting that prayer could become optional for anyone.
And what are the consequences of abandoning prayer in Islam?
Al-Jami cited a hadith. And just to remind everyone, a hadith is a saying or action of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Which Muslims consider a primary source of guidance.
Right, along with the Quran.
So what does this hadith say?
It says, the covenant between us and them is prayer, so whoever abandons it has disbelieved.
Whoa, that's pretty strong.
It is. It emphasizes the seriousness of neglecting prayer.
It's not just a minor slip-up. It's a fundamental break in your relationship with God.
Exactly. And Al-Jami also highlighted that numerous Quranic verses describe prayer as a defining characteristic of believers.
So it's not just about this one hadith. It's a consistent theme throughout Islamic teachings.
Absolutely.
And to further illustrate the gravity of challenging the obligation of prayer, Al-Jami shared a story, right?
Yeah, the story of Al-Jad ibn Dirham.
Who was he?
He was executed for denying that Allah spoke to Moses or took Abraham as a friend.
Even though he continued to pray with the Muslims.
Exactly. So even maintaining the outward act of prayer wasn't enough when core beliefs were challenged.
That really puts things into perspective.
It does.
Okay, so we've talked about spiritual elevation and prayer.
Right.
Let's move on to the third suspicion, which involves another core pillar of Islam, Zakat.
Or obligatory charitable giving.
And what were Mahmoud's views on this?
Well, he argued that Zakat, with its fixed amounts and regulations, was just a temporary measure.
Temporary.
Yeah, he claimed it was suitable for earlier, less developed times, but not for our advanced developed era.
So he basically saw it as outdated.
Exactly. And he advocated for something he called socialist justice.
Meaning?
He suggested abolishing individual ownership and redistributing all wealth and resources communally.
So a pretty radical departure from the traditional understanding of zakat.
It is, and Al-Jami firmly rejected this notion.
How so?
He emphasized that Islamic law is divine and meant to be followed always, regardless of societal advancements.
It's not about what's trendy or convenient. It's about obedience to God's commands.
Exactly, and he also highlighted that while Islam promotes justice and helping those in need, it also upholds the principle of individual ownership.
And he even quoted a hadith to support this point.
Right, the hadith that says, the wealth of a Muslim is not lawful except with his good will.
So it's about giving freely, not through coercion or forced redistribution.
Absolutely.
Now, Mahmoud also raised some specific criticisms of zakat. Right.
Yeah, he had a few suspicions, as Al-Jami called them.
Like what?
Well, firstly, he claimed that the very obligation of zakat justifies individual ownership, which he saw as problematic.
And how did Al-Jami respond to that?
He argued that individual ownership is a natural and necessary aspect of life ordained by God.
It's the foundation upon which the concept of giving from your own wealth is built.
Exactly.
What was Mahmoud's second suspicion?
He claimed that the Prophet Muhammad himself didn't pay zakat.
And what's the truth about that?
Al-Jami clarified that the Prophet didn't possess wealth that met the specific requirements for zakat to become obligatory. There are certain thresholds and a one-year holding period for zakat to apply.
So it wasn't that the Prophet rejected the principle of zakat, he just didn't meet the conditions for it.
Precisely, and had he met those conditions, he undoubtedly would have paid it.
Because he was the most exemplary in following God's commands.
Absolutely.
Okay, and what was Mahmoud's final suspicion regarding zakat?
He claimed that the Prophet and his family didn't accept zakat because they considered it filth.
What?
Yeah, a pretty bold claim.
And what's the truth behind this?
Al-Jami explained that while it's true that zakat was prohibited for the Prophet and his immediate family, there was a specific wisdom behind this prohibition.
What was his reasoning?
Mainly to avoid any appearance of self-benefit or conflict of interest.
Right, since he was the one establishing the rules and guidelines for zakat.
Exactly, but they were compensated through a specific share of the spoils of war.
So it wasn't about zakat being inherently impure. It was a specific ruling with a clear rationale.
Precisely.
It seems like Al-Jami carefully addressed all of Mahmoud's objections.
He did. And he consistently brought things back to the established understanding of Islamic teachings.
Now, beyond these specific points of contention, the lecture also delves into how Mahmoud allegedly misused religious texts.
Right. He took verses from the Quran and Hadiths out of context to support his unconventional views.
And this is where the danger of misinterpretation really comes into play.
Absolutely.
So let's examine some of these specific instances.
Okay.
What was the first verse Mahmoud supposedly twisted?
Well, there's a verse that talks about spending the excess, which Mahmoud interpreted as advocating for his idea of socialist justice.
And what verse is that?
It's from Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 219.
And how did Al-Jami counter this interpretation?
He explained that the verse actually encourages spending beyond one's needs, prioritizing oneself and one's dependents first.
So it's about responsible charitable giving, starting with those closest to you.
Exactly, and it doesn't negate the obligation of zakat.
Or justify Mahmoud's call for abolishing individual ownership.
Right. It's about the order and priority of giving, not about replacing an established pillar of Islam.
Okay, what's another example of a verse Mahmoud misinterpreted?
Well, he used the verse, "And those who strive for us, we will surely guide them to our ways."
To argue that.
To argue that individuals can attain knowledge of the truth directly from God without the need for prophets or established teachings.
Suggesting a kind of esoteric knowledge accessible only through intense spiritual striving.
Exactly.
And how did Al-Jami respond to this?
He saw it as a Sufi excess and emphasized that the verse simply means those who fear God and obey half. His commands will be guided.
It's about submitting to God's will, as revealed through his prophets and scriptures, not about bypassing those channels.
Right. It's about aligning yourself with the established path, not forging your own.
Okay, let's talk about another verse Mahmoud used, the one about Allah's throwing during battle.
Ah, yes, from Surah Al-Anfal, verse 17.
And he used this to argue that
There are multiple layers of meaning in religious texts, an outward literal meaning and an inward esoteric one.
So he saw it as justification for seeking hidden meanings beyond the apparent ones.
Exactly.
What was Al-Jami's take on this?
He firmly stated that the verse has a clear and direct meaning rooted in the historical event of the Battle of Badr.
Where the prophet threw a handful of dust and God caused it to affect the enemy.
Exactly. It highlights God's intervention and support for the believers, not a call for esoteric interpretations.
It's about understanding the miracle that occurred in that specific context, not about reading hidden meanings into every verse.
Right, and this is a recurring theme in Al-Jami's critique.
He emphasizes the importance of understanding the historical context and the apparent meaning of the text.
Absolutely.
Now, Mahmoud also cited a verse about fighting disbelievers adjacent to you, right?
Yes, from Surah At-Tawbah, verse 123.
And he used this to suggest
That it refers not only to fighting external enemies, but also to an internal struggle against one's own flaws and negative desires.
So he likened these inner struggles to the disbelievers within oneself.
Exactly, drawing on interpretations from some Sufi figures.
And Al-Jami's response.
He dismissed it as a ridiculous Sufi statement.
He didn't mince words.
No, he insisted that the verse clearly and solely refers to literal fighting against nearby disbelievers.
There's no need to invent allegorical meanings when the text is clear in its context.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to the fifth verse Mahmoud allegedly distorted, the one about the perfection of the religion.
That's from Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 3.
And what was Mahmoud's argument here?
He claimed that the verse only referred to the perfection of the Quran's revelation, not to the subsequent legislation and clarification provided by the Prophet's Sunnah.
So he's essentially challenging the authority and completeness of the Sunnah as a source of guidance.
Precisely, and Al-Jami considered this a reckless and shameless boldness.
Why?
Because it undermines the Prophet's role as the explainer and implementer of God's message.
And Al-Jami cited verses that support this role.
Right, verses like Quran 5.67 and 16.44, which explicitly mandate the Prophet's role in explaining the revelation.
So for Al-Jami, the perfection of the religion encompasses both the Quran and the Sunnah.
Absolutely. They are inseparable sources of guidance.
Now let's shift our attention to some of the hadiths Mahmoud allegedly misinterpreted.
Okay.
The first one is a pretty well-known saying, "We have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad."
Right, and Mahmoud used this to elevate the importance of inner spiritual struggle over physical jihad.
Suggesting that fighting one's own flaws is more important than fighting in the cause of God.
Exactly.
And what was Al-Jami's counter-argument?
He pointed out that this particular hadith is considered weak in its chain of narration by many scholars.
Meaning its authenticity is questionable.
Right, and even if it were authentic, its meaning is often misunderstood.
How so?
Well, physical jihad holds a very high status in Islam, and there's a great reward for those martyred in it.
And Al-Jami argued that those engaged in physical jihad are also simultaneously engaged in an inner struggle.
It's not an either situation. Both are important in their own contexts.
So Al-Jami essentially questioned both the reliability of the hadith and Mahmoud's interpretation of it.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to the second hadith Mahmoud allegedly misrepresented. The good deeds of the righteous are the bad deeds of the close ones.
Right, and he presented this as an established principle of Islamic law.
Implying that what might seem like a good deed for ordinary believers could be a sign of deficiency for those who are spiritually advanced.
Exactly.
And Al-Jami's response.
He clarified that this statement is not even a saying of the Prophet or his companions. It's attributed to a Sufi figure.
So it doesn't carry the same weight as an authentic hadith.
Exactly. And Al-Jami also argued that the statement itself is flawed in its meaning.
How so?
A genuinely good deed performed according to Islamic teachings remains good regardless of who performs it.
It's not relative to one's spiritual station.
Right. Any accompanying negative traits, like pride or self-admiration, are detrimental for everyone.
What was the third hadith Mahmoud misinterpreted?
The one about hidden polytheism.
And what's the hadith?
It says, "What I fear most for you is hidden polytheism." Al-Riya.
And how did Mahmoud explain this?
He selectively quoted only the first part of the hadith and then interpreted hidden polytheism as seeing oneself.
Meaning?
He saw it as a kind of excessive self-awareness or egoism.
And what was Al-Jami's correction?
He emphasized that Mahmoud omitted the Prophet's own definition of hidden polytheism,
Which is?
al-riya, which specifically refers to performing acts of worship or good deeds to show off or gain praise from others, rather than seeking God's pleasure.
So Mahmoud took the hadith out of context and imposed his own interpretation on it.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the fourth hadith, the one concerning the apparent and the hidden?
Right. Mahmoud used these terms to support his idea that Islamic law has both outward, literal aspects and inward, esoteric aspects.
And Al-Jami's perspective.
He acknowledged that these terms are indeed among the names of God. Yeah. He criticized Mahmoud for ignoring the Prophet's own specific use of these names in a prayer.
How did the Prophet use them?
He used them while also listing other divine attributes, like being the Lord of the heavens and the earth, the Creator, the Revealer of Scriptures, the first and the last.
So, Al-Jami's point is
that with such a clear prophetic explanation, there's no need to invent further interpretations that suggest hidden meanings within Islamic law.
It's about adhering to the established understanding based on the Prophet's own words and actions.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the fifth hadith? Behave with the morals of God.
Mahmoud used this to suggest that humans can acquire or possess divine attributes.
A pretty bold claim.
It is, and Al-Jami firmly rejected it.
How so?
He stated that this hadith has no basis in the authentic Sunnah and that its meaning is incorrect.
And he clarified the distinction between God's attributes and human attributes.
Right. Even though they might share similar names, they are fundamentally different in their essence and scope.
God's attributes are absolute and perfect, while human attributes are limited and imperfect.
Exactly.
This is about maintaining the absolute transcendence of God. Okay, let's move on to the sixth and final hadith Mahmoud allegedly misinterpreted. Allah created Adam in his image.
And he used this to argue that Adam possessed some of God's divine attributes.
What was Al-Jami's response?
He emphasized the importance of considering the full context of the hadith.
Which is?
The hadith was narrated in the context of the Prophet seeing a man striking his son or slave in the face.
And the Prophet instructed him to avoid the face because God created Adam in his image.
Exactly.
So the hadith is about respecting the human face.
Right. It's not a statement about Adam possessing divine attributes.
It's about recognizing the dignity of the human form, which was created in a similar form to Adam's.
Exactly.
So it seems Mahmoud consistently isolated phrases and verses, ignoring their context and established interpretations.
He did, and Al-Jami saw this as a dangerous and misleading approach.
It's a cautionary tale about the importance of careful and informed interpretation.
Absolutely.
So after this deep dive into Al-Jami's lecture, what's the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway is the importance of critical thinking and seeking knowledge from reliable sources.
It's about approaching religious texts with care and humility.
Right, and considering their linguistic nuances, historical contexts, and the interpretations of respected scholars.
It's about being wary of selective quoting and interpretations that lack a solid foundation.
Exactly.
And to leave our listeners with something to ponder, what's a final thought for them to consider?
How about this? How do the intellectual trends and social and political climates of different eras influence the way religious texts are interpreted?
That's a great question. These are questions worth exploring further.
They are.
Perhaps by delving into Islamic jurisprudence and studying the lives and methodologies of early Islamic scholars.
That's a great starting point for anyone who wants to go deeper.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this complex and fascinating discussion.
It's been my pleasure.
Until next time.